This is me. I studied at Imperial College London for 4 years, 3 for my bachelor's, 1 for my master's. I have done my fair share of working late nights in the library, drinking too much hot chocolate, cramming for exams, and yeah, falling sick from overworking.
And now, I can honestly say that I have officially forgotten most of the stuff that I've learned. Don't worry, there are a few good things that I have taken away from this experience. I scored first class honours twice during my bachelor's and master's degree. But that's not the point. The key thing is that I am not only proud to say that I have learned a lot from this journey, but I'm even prouder to say that I have made mistakes along the way. It is these mistakes that I have made that has allowed me to fine-tune my strategy and achieve this feat twice. And today, I'd like to share my journey, mistakes, and strategy with you with the hopes that they could be helpful for you in some way or another. Hey friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're new here, my name is Bianca, and today, I'd like to share how I scored first class honours twice at university. But before I get started, here's something that I'd like you to keep in mind. I'm not trying to say that I have the perfect formula for you to score the best possible grades. In fact, you could imagine my student life to be basically like a swan paddling hard beneath the surface of the waters in order to stay afloat. Whilst trying her absolute best, she just looked like everything is going fine and calm and composed on the surface. I'm a human being too. I am flawed in many ways as well. So just like any of my other videos, some of my advice could be advice. Take what is useful for you and just discard the rest. I won't get offended. Do what works best for you.
In case you might be curious to know, I studied biochemistry for my bachelor's degree before switching over to a business major at the business school, which is formerly known as the Masters in Management program. And in the UK, the grading system works like this. For first class honours or distinction, you need to get 70% and above. For the second best grade, upper second class honours or merit, you got to get an average of 60 to 69%. Next, for lower second class honours or a pass in your masters, it's a 50 to 59% range. And finally, for third class honours in your undergrad, you need to score between 40 to 49%, whilst for a masters, that will be a failing grade. In case you are following the US grading system, I've included the equivalent GPA for each classification on the right.
So now that you have a bit of context as to how UK university students are graded, let's now talk about the mistakes that I have made in my first year and what I have learned from them. So the first mistake I made was that I tried to get through university via rote learning, which basically means that I was memorizing information by repetition, repetition, and repetition. I mean, after all, this is a biochemistry degree. It is all about memorizing the course content, right? And to be fair, this strategy actually worked out pretty well for me back in high school and A-levels. Nope, I have never been so wrong. I thought that reading and memorizing equals to learning and understanding. And this led to bigger and bigger problems. For instance, the time given for revision at university was far shorter than in school. I actually had exams 1 week right after we have covered the course syllabus, so that gave me really too little time for the information to enter my long-term memory. As a result, my first set of exams basically involved me walking into the exam hall and just borderline panicking as I worked through the exam paper. The second mistake that I made was that I started the game with a defeatist mindset. Part of it was because I was cracking under my own artificial pressure. Another part of it was because I severely lacked self-confidence. I entered university believing that the lecture content is going to be really hard and I am not going to be understanding anything at all. It is going to be a struggle and I have to work really hard to get anywhere. And that basically became a self-fulfilling prophecy. My coursework and exams became challenging for me because I believed that they are going to be tough. I didn't trust my learning capabilities and I got too stressed because of that. And since I got so stressed, I basically imploded before any real challenge even started. I ended up scraping a 2-1 in my first year, despite working super hard. And that's when I thought, that's it. That was the limit to my intelligence. As you can see, there was a lot of growing up that I had to do. That brings me to an important point. I personally believe that everyone is capable of achieving a first. It is just a matter of establishing a system to manage yourself and your workload effectively. In my case, it was a lot about me needing the courage to admit that my approach to studying was wrong, and thereby letting go of past tactics that just wasn't serving me anymore. The first change I made was to aim to understand things from first principles thinking. That's basically a fancy way of saying that start your learning from the most elemental concepts and then build your understanding towards those that are covered in the classroom. This brings me to talk about the concept of scaffolding, where it basically is a technique where you learn new material by building upon previously understood concepts. For example, in maths, you would teach children how to count like 1, 2, 3 before you start teaching them things like addition or subtraction, which are just slightly more complicated versions of counting. So let's just say that you are now progressing the class by teaching the children how to add or subtract, perhaps by asking them questions like, what is 3 plus 3? Chances are that they'll be counting on your fingers, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Oh, that's 6! And just like that, you can start teaching them more and more complicated concepts like calculus or, God forbid, geometry by just scaffolding from counting and so on. And I believe that the point still stands for any other subject. When you struggle to understand something, don't just blindly memorize and then pray that you can pass an exam despite that. Instead, try going backwards and internalize the basic principles. And maybe that might actually help you to build towards understanding what you are actually trying to study. And scaffolding also helps you to create stories for yourself. And stories are always a great way for you to remember complicated concepts better. That being said, another habit that I started to pick up as I progressed through university was to consistently ask why. For example, if you're in a chemistry practical, there's absolutely no harm for you to ask, hey, what's the purpose of this protocol? Is there a reason why we're doing this step or that step? This helps you in two ways. First, it is a good way for you to test your assumptions of how much you actually understand your subject. And trust me, this is actually a pretty important thing to do when you enter the real working world. Secondly, this reinforces my point about avoiding rote learning because understanding the core concepts is a much more effective way for you to remember complicated concepts rather than playing the memory game. Moving on to my second tip, I would advise you to know your enemy and work smartly around it. This basically means that if you want to do well in your coursework and exams, to some extent, it is about figuring out what your lecturer or marker wants and then giving them exactly that. And there are many ways to do this. The first and easiest way is for you to familiarize yourself with the marking scheme and find out what exactly tips the scale between a submission that is awarded a first class versus one that is awarded a 2-1 and so on. Besides that, ask your friends and seniors for help if you have to, because the truth is, very few people succeed completely on their own. And doing so can be a great way for you to figure out who's the stricter marker, what kind of marking style do they normally adopt, and what kind of answers do they usually like to hear, etc. In my case, my examiners love it when we are able to draw links between different course modules and to also include loads of outside reading, meaning that we're able to write about stuff beyond the lecture material. So for every topic that was covered in the exam, I would just spend a little bit of extra time skimming through the introduction, abstract, and conclusion of at least 3 research papers outside each of the lecture material, just to increase my chances of doing well. Next in line, I will also strongly encourage you to share your own ideas and opinions in your work, as it can really give it some extra spice. Not meaning to say that we have to be completely original, because let's be realistic, we're still students, we're still learning the topic. But that doesn't mean you can't share what you personally think about the topic based on your experiences and what you have read from the works of others. That way, you can increase your chances of including content that is not covered by your peers, and this makes your work much more unique. How to do it? It's pretty simple. For instance, when you're writing an essay, include sources beyond your class reading list or even those from different fields, but may still have relevant content to the topic that you're writing about. The best pieces of work that I've seen usually includes sources from a wide range of mediums, and that includes things like online journals or books. Other than that, another trick that I'd like to share with you would be to dare to challenge authority under the right circumstances. Basically, criticize other people's work if you feel like it is necessary. But of course, only make a bold counter-statement if you have already read extensively around the field and have all the appropriate sources to back your statement. If you manage to pull it off, I would dare to say that it makes your work much more entertaining, especially given that your markers are probably already reading hundreds of the same coursework or exam scripts anyway. So doing this might be a great way to grab their attention. Now, for my fourth tip, I would like to pay forward one of the most important tips that my seniors shared with me back in my first year, and that would be to focus on continuous improvement. Getting a first is not meant to be easy. It requires a lot of hard work and dedication. But that doesn't mean that you have to be perfect from day one. Just like how I wasn't perfect in my first year of university, I would advise you to make all the mistakes that you need to make as early as possible, ideally all within your first year, so that you can learn from them quickly and not repeat them in your future years. But of course, not all mistakes are created equal. I don't mean to say that you're supposed to half-ass your homework. In fact, I would actually strongly suggest that you take all of your coursework, tests, and exams seriously, even if they weigh like 5% of your module, because each and every one of them is a learning opportunity. The point is, do your very best, and if you didn't make the mark, you can then pinpoint where exactly has things gone wrong on your end, so you know what exactly not to do in the future. Another thing that I would recommend you to do is to actively ask for feedback whenever you get your work back. Schedule an appointment with your lecturer or marker to better understand where exactly you could have done better. Oftentimes, I was actually pretty surprised when many of the lecturers actually told me that I was one of the only students who actually scheduled an appointment with them to understand how I could improve my work. So this brings me to say that your lecturers are really there to help you. In fact, they always appreciate an enthusiastic learner who's willing to take the extra step and to ask questions out of curiosity. Other than that, there really isn't any reason for you to fear your markers, because after all, they are all just human beings who are more than willing to take the time to guide you through your learning journey. The next advice is something that I've also covered in one of my previous videos. It is probably a controversial one, but stop following others and do what works best for you. And I'm saying this because of my experiences and observations. For instance, I remember one of my professors telling the entire class that students who tend to watch the entire lecture recordings would usually do less well than those who don't. So at one point, come 9 AM or 4 PM, I attended every single lecture. The problem was, I realized that I just really struggled to concentrate during classes because I just wasn't an auditory learner. And next thing you know, I wasted a lot of time because I found myself having to rewatch the same lecture recordings again. But once I accepted that I just work better by doing something else like going to the gym during the day and then catching up with lectures in the evening, things just became so much more efficient. And I realized that I could add more stuff into my calendar because of that. And actually, I think most people would have warned you to never leave things to the last minute. Again, this is not for everybody, but I actually do have a friend who does his best work when working on stuff at the very last minute. And I found it to be really amusing because he embraced that side of himself really well, and he ended up scoring a first anyway. Well, what can I say? I do actually kind of respect that. So to some extent, you got to experiment and figure out what sorts of working styles and conditions you thrive in, and then tailor your learning experience to suit that if you want to do your very best. But of course, in most cases, please don't be like my friend. Don't leave things to the last minute. For my final advice, my supervisor told me that we all ought to pick our battles wisely. That goes on to say that if you're in a position where you're lucky enough to pick your modules, which I suppose is typically the case in the later years of your degree, choose modules that you actually enjoy studying and you're pretty decent at. On top of that, this is somewhat debatable, but try not to pick modules that sound like it is easier to score at, or it just sounds sexier on your CV. And I say this because it is a much more strategic way for you to play to your strengths, as well as make the process much more interesting. So those are the general tips that I have regarding how you could score a first in your degree. Well, If you happen to have this intense desire to rank first in your entire cohort, one of my close friends has actually agreed to share how he managed to do so. For some context, he actually won the governor's prize in biochemistry, which basically translates to him ranking first in an entire year group of 150 people, I think. That's, I would say, is usually the typical size of a university cohort. Overachievers. Unfortunately, he's a little camera shy, so I'll be doing the talking on his behalf. Please bear with me on that. Oh wow, already looks smarter. To start with, I think it's important to first realize that scoring well overall would usually mean that you need to score well in both your coursework as well as your exams. So I'll give my tips under these two umbrellas. For your coursework, the key is to be really clear at communicating and understanding your target audience. Is it targeted to a fellow student, a lay audience, or perhaps a professor? One useful trick I learned that applies to most coursework is that imagine that you're writing this for a student who has completely missed all the lectures. For my second point, prose is important. Don't underestimate how crucial written communication is. Even though working on written communication is indeed a real challenge, and I doubt that anyone is in a position to say that they have mastered it, there are definitely many ways for you to make yourself better at it. And the best way, in my opinion, is to read loads and practice. Read academic articles, newspapers, fiction, non-fiction, and try to look into how the author described things as well as convey and analyze information. Then, try to integrate those learnings into your own writing. And of course, ask people to look over your work. Getting feedback can sometimes be a little humiliating, but it is vital if you want to improve your writing. Lecturers won't always give you feedback, so just like how Bianca said, it is down to you to go and ask for it. For my third point, regardless of whether you're taking an arts or science major, developing really good written communication skills alongside good illustration skills are really the foundations for you to do well in either your essay or report-based coursework. So, work a lot on your illustration skills because having a visual summarization of the key concepts as well as arguments that you're trying to convey is extremely useful to your reader, and it can elevate your piece of coursework. To do so, I would recommend looking at figures from academic articles and then using them as a starting point for your own. Moving on to my fourth point, certain coursework may require you to present to an audience. It might be your professor, peers, or complete strangers. So for my final coursework tip, I would strongly recommend you to practice public speaking during your spare time. It's definitely very daunting and something I certainly haven't mastered. I'm not even on camera right now. It sounds really obvious, but the best advice is still practice. Watch some TED Talks or good speeches and just practice out loud in front of a mirror or perhaps in front of your computer for online presentations. Make sure to practice speaking at a reasonable pace and to use your body language appropriately. Personally, I like to practice my presentations in front of my friends and families. Or you can be like Bianca and go and start a YouTube channel. Oh, and a very tempting thing to do, especially for online presentations, is to write a full script of what you're going to say ad verbatim. I personally really don't recommend this because if public speaking gives you anxiety, writing a full script is kind of like running away from the problem. So, by constantly writing your scripts ad verbatim, you stifle your development in impromptu speaking. And this could lead to future problems when you're faced with job interviews, vivas, stage presentations, speaking to media, or anything that literally puts you on the spot. Now that we have covered how you can score well in your coursework, let's now move on to the exams bit. Let's start with some of the more general tips. Firstly, there's a lot to studying well other than mastering your exam techniques. Arguably, the psychological aspects are far more important because it can be really difficult for you to do much if you're not in a healthy spot. To begin with, eat enough food, sleep enough, and drink enough water. Studying is far harder when you're not doing all of these. Other than that, take breaks every so often. It's really up to you regarding whether you want to take lots of small breaks or take one really long break. The important thing is to have some time where you can de-stress and not think about work for a little bit. It's normal to be anxious and stressed. I feel those as well, so taking breaks can always be a helpful way for you to manage them. Also, Plan something that you'll do right after your exams as a celebration. It doesn't have to be something grandiose. If buying a tub of ice cream and eating it whilst watching a movie is your thing, go do it. The key thing is to have light at the end of the tunnel while you're studying. Bear in mind that this is coming from someone who ranked first in the year. As you can probably tell, he is clearly not a robot. So he made sure that his basic needs are taken care of. Being first place does not mean that you have to sacrifice your health in order to achieve what you want. For my second point, have a plan, but don't be too strict about it. This is subjective, of course, but I find it easier to say, I'll cover topics XYZ over the next few days, and if I don't understand it, I'll go back to it later, rather than saying something like, I'm going to cover topic XYZ on the 28th and 29th of December, and then I'm going to cover topics ABC on the 1st and 2nd of January. In my opinion, overly rigid schedules are too stress-inducing. And the reality is that revision will not always go to plan anyways, since it may take more or less time to study certain concepts. Now, moving on to some revision tips. My first point kind of overlaps with Bianca's point about scaffolding and first principles thinking. And it is to always start from the basics. And sometimes this might mean going back to things that you learned before university. There's no shame in that. For example, it is going to be much harder for you to understand protein biochemistry if you've forgotten a lot of high school chemistry. Likewise, if you're trying to analyze literature that's written in a foreign language, but you've forgotten most of the grammar, it's going to be really hard for you to make any sense out of it. For my next tip, there's always seems to be this point during revision where words are being read, but none of the understanding is going into my head. Don't worry about that too much, because this happens to me plenty of times as well. When this happens, I find it really useful for me to take a step back and to try to verbalize what I understand to someone who is unfamiliar with this topic. For instance, to a pre-university student or to my parents. From my experience, doing this helps to iron out what I actually do understand and what I don't understand. If I can explain something simply, this will usually mean that I have a pretty good grasp of the concept. But if I happen to be struggling to explain stuff without overusing too much technical jargon, this may mean that I will need to review the concept more. For my next tip, practice, practice, and practice with no half measures. Cover the topics that you want to revise in depth, and then practice writing your answers under time pressure to simulate your exam conditions as much as possible. After that, compare your answers with the model answers or perhaps your lecture notes and try to fill out anything you may have missed or have completely misunderstood. For this, it's important to be completely honest with yourself and try to not say things like, oh, I remember it in an exam, I don't need to write this down, or maybe something like, it's similar to my notes anyway, I'll just ignore that. For my final advice, collaborate with others. Past papers are very helpful for getting exam practice, but the same point still stands for working with a friend to come up with questions that test each other's understanding. If everyone is too preoccupied with studying, or if you have no friends, you can always try to pretend that you're giving a lecture to other students. Overall, I find this another really helpful method for me to identify any gaps in my understanding. That's all the tips I have. Just always bear in mind that there is always some degree of subjectivity in here, so not all of my tips will work for everyone. Again, pick which ones that you feel will be helpful for yourself. Thank you. Well, a big thanks to my friend for sharing his advice. And now, before I end this video, I have a few final thoughts to share and a confession to make. Ask anyone who knows me well, and chances are that they would say, I'm really not that smart. I personally have never done an IQ test, but I wouldn't be too surprised if the results showed that I only have an average level of intelligence. Not meaning to say this in a self-deprecating sense. The point that I'm trying to make here is that you don't have to be a genius to score first. It's actually a lot about putting in the hard work and being strategic with your actions. And I hope that being honest with this side of myself can help you to realize that you probably can do it too. This brings me to my second thought. As much as how unrealistic as it probably sounds, I would still encourage you to work as if you're aiming for the top spot, as in first place, dean's list, or whatever equivalent position it may be. Because what the experience of striving for excellence truly gave me wasn't actually the grades. It was the sense of responsibility, the resilience, and the passion. So even if you fail, it is not the end of the world, because arguably, it is a process of struggling where we would learn the most about ourselves and build our character. You might even realize your superpowers during your journey. All of these side effects, well, in my personal opinion, are far more important than your grades. And there really shouldn't be any shame attached to wanting better things for yourself. But of course, don't go overboard with it. Strike a balance. And for my final point, stop watching videos like this and just start studying. Don't worry, I have also fallen into the trap of trying to optimize for the best strategy, management, timing, etc. rather than actually studying. So to some extent...
Do it! Just do it!
But wait, before you go, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. If you enjoyed the video or found it super helpful for you, I would always appreciate if you could hit the like, subscribe, and bell icon, and I will always thank you from the bottom of my heart for that. Hopefully my tips can help you to become more efficient with studying so that you can work on other things on the side. Good luck with your journey ahead, and if you're interested, I have produced another video where I talk about the 5 things that I wish I've known before starting university. Do check it out if you happen to be taking a break from revision. Take it easy there in the meantime, and see you in my next video. Bye!